Hi, I'm Ryan Carniato, creator of the JavaScript framework SolidJS, and I'm excited to be here at ViteConf to tell you about it. This talk is called Getting Started, which plays off the name of our starter template meta framework, SolidStart. And I'm not sure we'd be here if it weren't for Vite. Well, obviously we wouldn't be at this conference, but I don't know if I'd have taken the plunge into trying to create such an ambitious project as SolidStart. All the hours, the late nights, and the maintenance burden that comes with it. I kid, but seriously, I never wanted to make a meta framework. If you look on GitHub, there are issues from a few years ago where I said as much. However, Vite changed everything. Vite has enabled a whole new way to look at developing tools on the web platform, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. But first, perhaps a brief introduction to SolidJS is in order. What is Solid? Well, it's a JavaScript framework for building user interfaces, like so many before it. But let's get right to the elephant in the room. Why would I build another JavaScript framework? Well, a little history here. Development started back in 2016. For context, that was the same year Svelte was created. My goal was to bring back fine-grained reactivity, similar to Knockout.js. I love the patterns of using function components and building UIs from composing small reusable behaviors. I never really made the full move to component lifecycles. They reminded me too much of ASP.NET, web forms, and honestly, that terrified me. The performance claims of the virtual DOM confused me as well, and I knew reactivity to be performant. Maybe we just needed to attack it a different way. So I did, and for all of what became abundantly clear was that for all the good that component architectures had brought, and I mean they are everywhere in modern front-end development, we've conflated code organization with execution lifecycles. Pretty much every framework, components have runtime considerations. They are our primary state management. They're our renderer, our everything. And this wasn't limited to the virtual DOM. It was true for compiled solutions as non-compiled. Tag template literals to VDOMs, single file components to the hottest DSLs. Everything just running top down. I get it. There's a bit of who cares, but it informs every subsequent question. What do I memoize? When do I memoize? What do I use for global state? How do I share reactivity? When to use effect? What's the difference between redux and context? Why does this log twice? Why does this stupid thing keep re-rendering? These are topics that dominate the conversation, and really, I'd rather be talking about pretty much anything. There are a lot of things that are just unlocked when you change the perspective a little bit. And I can definitely wax poetic about the power of reactivity, how it's declarative and composable, how it helps produce well-structured code with reusable behaviors, and that are independent of any component system. Even how, with a few basic primitives, you can do everything you could ever wish for, including rendering. And with performance we haven't seen since hand-optimized vanilla JavaScript. But that's not why I'm here today. I'm here to talk about a different sort of primitive, and that is the power of plugins in the Vite platform, and how they are instrumental for me doing a complete 180 on my perspective. Which is a lot, because I am naturally an unbundler. I like breaking stuff apart and shifting boundaries. I like proving new concepts, and tend to leave it to others to pass the final judgment on what the right approach is to put it all together. So let's look at why Vite presented me with something I just couldn't easily dismiss. Well, it starts with understanding desired outcomes. I knew server-side rendering was going to be key to where things were heading. A lot of innovation in this space is finding how to better leverage that server-client divide. So SSR needed to be part of the package. But at the same time, I was not willing to throw single-page apps under a bus. It needed to support both, and seamlessly. Moving from client to server shouldn't feel like a chore. And while we are at it, we should have all the niceties, things like file system routing and more ingrained patterns for data fetching and mutation. And of course, it should fully leverage Solid's unique view of reactivity and rendering and be deployable anywhere. At the same time, there were things I did not want to deal with. Having to wrangle a bunch of configuration is no fun. Also, I didn't want to be too opinionated. Well, opinions can be good. First and foremost, this needs to work for everything. And I don't want to be responsible, well, at least that responsible for people's destiny. I've never liked or bothered with meta frameworks myself. So when building a project, why would I try to push that on someone else? Similarly, I didn't want to present a bunch of exclusive ideas. Like if someone chose not to use this project, they shouldn't feel they aren't fully leveraging Solid. And this really extends to APIs and libraries. Ideally, you just use everything that already existed in the ecosystem. I'd already created a nested router with parallelized data fetching long before I ever thought of making a meta framework. Honestly, I don't want the maintenance burden. You can start to see why I wasn't too interested. How do we possibly get all the upsides without the downsides? Well, as it turns out, Vite 2 couldn't have come out at a better time. The big thing being it offered a single configuration for adding SSR. This was the first problem I needed to solve. Historically, bundlers didn't concern themselves with this, and while you could make a bunch of configs, it wasn't as easy as just running a bundler with a flag. And this is important because it conceptually meant that we have this flexibility now to lay these things on top of each other without additional wiring. We didn't need to be opinionated about client versus server rendering. And this is kind of exemplified on the plugin system that Vite has. It's based roughly on rollup plugins. And you can author these universal plugins that work across the whole platform. Now, the devil is in the details here, a lot of nuance, but Vite was stacked with a lot of things to make our lives a lot easier. Things like glob imports to handle dynamic file paths. Can we say file system routing? And almost the trivial ability to create virtual modules to allow for custom compilations to break our modules apart. And the best part of this is it's just a common base of just a plugin. There's no need for an actual meta framework, just a collection of Vite plugins. And we realized this almost immediately. Like, we had to do so little to leverage an existing ecosystem. Things like CSS were already part of it. And while maybe there'd be some Solid specific features, anything we built for SolidStart would work in any Solid project. More so, SolidStart could be used for any Solid project. Everything being modular as it is. This addresses half the things on my to avoid list without doing anything. If we wanted file system routing, that worked with Solid's router. There was no point in making SolidStart router. We just build it as a Vite plugin. We ship SolidStart as source instead of being pre-built, and it just slides in everywhere. A huge win for maintainability. But of course, that's just the direct benefit. What we found since it is even better than that. With such a modular approach, we've been able to test ideas rapidly. It's just a matter of writing another Vite plugin. And this sort of experimentation is really important to us. Let me give you an example. We want Solid to work the same client and server and use the same libraries like Solid's router, but there is a definite need for server-specific features. Things like get server-side props in Next or loaders in Remix, but we didn't want to compromise. And we wanted to keep all the benefits we'd come to desire from being modular and composable. The pattern for Solid the past several years has been to define a data function that is attached to each nested route section and runs in parallel to the code splitting. This lets us set up our resources, which are basically a special signal that takes a promise, and handle it in parallel. And this mechanism worked really well because if left alone, it will fetch on the server during initial SSR and then again from the browser on subsequent navigation. But what if I want to always fetch on the server? Well, we had an idea. What if a function could be on the server? I mean, any function. This isn't a new idea. We've seen stuff like this in Blitz.js. But what if we could leverage Vite's plugin system to make this just an opt-in behavior, like file system routing? We could just test an idea and see how it would sit. We immediately saw that meant we could preserve types across the boundary, and this was really quite nice. We could just define a function anywhere, and you didn't need to worry about a URL or API. The URL is also available as a property of that function, so you can use it in APIs designed to handle URLs. We've actually used this to wire up things like WebSockets and server-sent events. But the takeaway is suddenly we had a primitive to do network communication in a type-safe way. And we could use it anywhere. We could put as many server functions we wanted in any file. So it turns out we can just plug this right into our resources as well. Suddenly we have a function now that always runs on the server. It's nice how primitives compose like that. And we can write a wrapper to clean it up a little bit, and well, we're in business. While it's a little bulkier than a simple async function or loader, we get a couple cool things here, like the first argument to our resource acting as a cache invalidation key. So we can granularly invalidate these things the way one would with libraries like TanStack Query. We also can create as many of these server data or resources as we want on the given route and handle them all independently. And on the other side, we wanted actions for mutations. And again, if using the server mechanism, we could define them in any file, as many actions in any file as we wanted. We could basically use these to track the progress of our mutations and manage optimistic updates. By default, they'll just refresh all the data on the current route, but because they're granular, they can also trigger their own invalidation keys. And did I mention they export progressively enhanced forms that work with no JavaScript? This all just piles on top of each other, right? You can define as many of these actions as you want in a file, as they are just server functions, and not feel the restrictions of having to adhere to a file-based API for local mutations or worrying about over-refetching on invalidation. It's sort of like a marriage between something like Remix and TanStack Query. And my favorite part of this story is that it started from an experiment with a primitive. That's basically how we develop in Solid. We create a primitive and try to see how it can be used to determine its place in the world. Sometimes there's obvious need that can only be handled in the core and it ends up in the core. But other times we test ideas for months in our Solid primitives repo and, then we learn what the lessons we need to learn. People have been doing incredible things with Babel with Solid, getting Svelte-like compilations and trying new DSL ideas because of how easy it's to build on top of. And for me, the second I saw Vite, I knew we were into more of the same. But if you aren't convinced, one more example. I want to show you an experiment we're working on right now. A huge shout out to Nikhil Saraf here, who put together the pieces to make this demo possible. I'm going to demo an app that I am all too familiar with, the old Hacker News demo. And if you haven't seen SolidStart, it's essentially just a Vite project. You see there's a Vite config right here, and we just plug in our Solid plugin. And we're very easily able to actually just port over one of our existing Vite templates for client side, because all we needed to do really was take the index HTML that exists in our Vite project and kind of convert it to this JSX thing. There's some details here, like our router uses file routes to suggest that it wants to use file system routing. Once in place, we basically just have our router, and the only other little tweak we had to do really was our data functions, which used to be in separate files, can now be just at the top of the file. And this is very similar to what we were looking at on the previous slides. So let's try our example in action. Start up our server, and this is just your typical Hacker News app. We just navigate around. It's client rendered, client navigated, and there's basically some story listing pages, and then you can go into the specific story and collapse the comments if you wish. And just to show you that it's client rendered, let's look at the network tab. When I load this, what you'll see is initial HTML loading, some JavaScript and CSS, and then you'll see that the stories and the data API call are happening at the same time, and then it client renders. And in fact, you can actually see that the HTML we send has an empty body, and it's a pretty typical single page app. From there, when we navigate to a new page, what we'll see is essentially the new JavaScript and the fetch for the data to that page happening in parallel. And this is all thanks to Solid's router. There's nothing new here. But perhaps it would be nice to server render this page. So I'm just going to go into our Vite config for our plugin and just go server SSR true. And now with a quick build, and I'm doing the production build here instead of just doing dev mode because I actually want to show off the resources. Vite has great HMR. We can see when I reload the page that now the majority of the work actually happens on the server while it fetches the data, and then all the rest of the JavaScript loads in parallel. And we can actually see when we look at our rendered page, and now we have a full page that contains all our story listings and serialized JSON that we need to display them. But again, from here, when we navigate around, this is the same client-side routing that we've come to accustomed to. And this is pretty typical that you find in most meta frameworks. But we thought, well, why stop here? I've been seeing really cool things being done in frameworks like Astro and Fresh. So we're like, what happens if we tried to make it a multi-page app with interactive islands instead? So this is an example of us just playing around with a Vite plugin and seeing what we could do. So what we need to do to make those comment collapsing still interactive is just have a way of defining them as an island. And kind of as an experiment, again, using this Vite plugin, we realized, well, what if we could just import our component kind of similar to how we import lazy components. And which one is it? It's a toggle, and kind of define it as an island. And what we're actually doing here is we're looking for this, and actually we're doing a compiler swap that affects the build process, again, thanks to Vite. And if I run this now and start, previously we were looking at about 15 kilobytes of JavaScript on our page in order to basically load all the interactivity and do the rendering. And this is the same on client and server rendering. But in this new islands mode, when we refresh the page, we don't need nearly as much JavaScript. And when we go into our story, it's literally just 5 kilobytes of JavaScript, just enough to trigger the hydration of our islands. And as you can see, this still works. So we have the same interactivity and same experience at about a third of the cost in JavaScript. But again, we have this whole platform available to us. What else can we do? Well, we thought, wouldn't it be cool if we could do islands and still have maybe client-side routing? Because, sorry, I didn't show it off here. With the islands, as you navigate around, you can see this refresh. It's a full page refresh. I can just show this really easily. If we expand out some elements here, we navigate, it's re-rendering the whole page. This is fine, and we still get the benefits of having less JavaScript and great page load performance. But so again, just through Vite plugins, what if we could kind of try to see if we could get the best of both worlds? And yeah, we could load maybe 5 kilobytes of JavaScript initially, but now when we go into our story, we get the extra JavaScript for that toggle, which still works. But as I'm navigating around, we're just fixed at 6 kilobytes of JavaScript. And we're getting client-side routing. What's actually happening here is we're swapping out the portion of the page that changes. The header never re-renders. So when we go here, we're just swapping it out. This is a nested server-rendered client router. Honestly, there's just so much here to play with that I'm pretty excited. I mean, I can't wait till someone realizes that with server functions, it can kind of do a SolidStart inception. Honestly, the boundaries seem endless here. So that's all I have to say. I was too lazy to make another slide, but mostly because it's really hard to top this one. In the same way SolidStart is going to be the foundation for solid applications in the future, Vite has been instrumental in making SolidStart a reality. I would have told you it would be crazy to take this on before, but now I can't picture not being able to give people such valuable tools to help them making the best web applications. I suppose this talk can't be called Getting Started without showing you all how to get started with SolidStart. npm init solid. That's it. And you'll be on your way to creating the next generation of websites and applications. So thank you, Vite, and thank you all.